In the sun-baked frontier of Sagebrush Territory, 1876, a young woman's calloused hands could mend a fence at dawn and thread a bullet through a bottle cap at 200 yards by twilight. Ellie Matthews had learned the weight of her father's rifle before she'd learned the weight of loss, mastering both by the age of 14 when the Red Vultures gunned him down. For 5 years, she kept her father's lessons close and his rifle closer, while the territory's most feared gang built their empire on broken bones and stolen dreams. They'd killed 17 men across 3 territories, broken the spirit of 12 towns, and made sheriffs tremble at the mere whisper of their name. But when Kane Maddox and his Red Vultures rode into Sagebrush, they made the same mistake that had sealed the fate of every tyrant since time began. They mistook patience for weakness, and a young woman's quiet smile for surrender. That mistake wouldn't just cost them their empire. It would become the story that mothers would tell their daughters for generations to come, about the farm girl who taught the West that true strength lies not in the power to inspire fear, but in the courage to stand against it. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields as Ellie Matthews wiped the sweat from her brow, her calloused hands gripping the handle of a well-worn pitchfork. At 19, she had already spent more hours working this land than most folks twice her age. The early summer breeze carried the sweet scent of hay and wildflowers, mixing with the earthy aroma of freshly tilled soil. "Ellie, the chickens are at it again." Her 12-year-old brother Ben's voice rang out from behind the barn. "Mrs. Henderson's going to have our heads if they get into her garden one more time." Ellie couldn't help but smile as she propped the pitchfork against the barn wall. "Well then, you better help me round them up before she notices." She jogged toward the commotion, her long brown hair bouncing in its practical braid. The siblings spent the next few minutes corralling the escape artist chickens, their laughter echoing across the farmyard. Once the last bird was safely back in the coop, Ben's eyes lit up with that familiar mischievous glint. "Hey Ellie, I've been practicing with my slingshot," he announced proudly, pulling the handmade weapon from his back pocket. "But I can hit more targets than you now." Ellie raised an eyebrow, remembering their father's words about staying humble. "Oh really? And what makes you so sure about that, little brother?" Ben was already gathering tin cans from behind the tool shed. "Because I've been practicing every day. Come on, I'll show you." He began arranging the cans along the fence post, each one carefully spaced. "We'll take turns. 5 shots each, and whoever hits the most wins." "And what exactly am I supposed to use?" Ellie asked, playing along. "Since you've got the only slingshot." Ben's face fell for a moment before brightening again. "Wait right here." He disappeared into the barn, returning moments later with their father's old hunting rifle. "You can use this. It's only fair since you're older and all." Ellie's heart skipped a beat at the sight of the familiar weapon. If Ben only knew how many hours she'd spent with that very rifle, practicing in secret. "I don't know, Ben. Mama wouldn't like us using Pa's gun." "Please? I promise we'll be careful. Just like Pa taught us." His eager eyes wore down her resistance. "All right, but just this once," she conceded, taking the rifle with practiced ease that she carefully masked as uncertainty. "You go first, hotshot." Ben took his position, tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. His first stone missed completely, causing a few nearby birds to scatter. The second clipped the edge of a can, making it wobble but not fall. His third was a solid hit, sending the can flying. The fourth and fifth shots both missed, leaving him with a single hit out of 5 attempts. "Not bad," Ellie encouraged, noting how his stance had improved. "That's better than last time." "Your turn," Ben said, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. "But don't feel bad if you can't hit any. Pa always said rifles are trickier than slingshots." Ellie lifted the rifle, deliberately making her movements appear slightly awkward. She let her first shot go wide, watching Ben's grin widen. The second shot also missed, though not by quite as much. Then, making a show of taking extra time to aim, she allowed herself to hit the next 3 cans in quick succession. "Wow!" Ben exclaimed, his jaw dropping. "That was amazing. How did you do that?" "Just got lucky, I suppose," Ellie shrugged, quickly lowering the rifle. "Must be Pa watching over me." Their moment of levity was interrupted by the distant sound of hooves approaching along the main road. Ellie instinctively moved between Ben and the noise, her grip tightening on the rifle. But it was only Mr. Wilson, the town's banker, riding past their farm on his way to Sagebrush. "You kids be careful out here," he called out as he passed. "Word is the Red Vultures hit another town, just 2 days' ride from here. Took everything they could carry and left 3 good men dead." The mention of the Notorious gang cast a shadow over the bright morning. Ellie's jaw tightened as she watched Mr. Wilson continue down the road toward town. "Ben, help me get these morning chores finished up. I need to make a supply run into Sagebrush before noon." The town of Sagebrush was a collection of weather-beaten buildings strung along a single dusty main street. What had once been a promising frontier settlement had become a shadow of its intended glory, with more boarded-up windows than open ones. The sound of Ellie's boots on the wooden sidewalk echoed off the false fronts of the buildings, most of which stood a story taller than they actually were, an attempt at grandeur that fooled no one. As she approached Tanner's general store, she passed Sheriff Monroe, standing in front of his office, apparently fascinated by something in the distance. He barely acknowledged her greeting, his hand nervously adjusting the badge that seemed to weigh heavily on his chest. Everyone knew he'd only taken the job because no one else wanted it, and it showed in every hesitant movement he made. The bell above Tanner's door announced her arrival, and the familiar smell of coffee, leather, and dried goods greeted her. Mrs. Tanner looked up from her ledger, her round face creasing into a warm smile. "Ellie, dear, your usual supplies?" "Yes, ma'am. And some extra coffee if you've got it. Mama says the old tin's almost empty." As Mrs. Tanner gathered the items, other customers filtered in and out of the store. A group of women huddled near the fabric section, their whispered conversations carrying just enough for Ellie to catch fragments. "Third town this month. Sheriff won't even talk about it. Just a matter of time before they come here." The bell chimed again, and a weathered man Ellie didn't recognize entered, pulling a small cart laden with goods. His clothes were travel-stained, and his eyes carried the weary look of someone who'd seen too much of the world's darker side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, removing his hat. "Name's Tucker Mills, traveling peddler. Got some fine goods to trade if anyone's interested." He began unpacking his cart, but his next words froze everyone in place. "Though I should warn you, prices might be going up soon. Just came through Copper Creek. Or what's left of it." Mrs. Tanner's hand flew to her mouth. "Copper Creek? But that's less than 50 miles from here." Tucker nodded grimly. "Red Vultures paid them a visit 3 days ago. Took everything worth taking, burned what wasn't. Sheriff tried to stand up to them." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Well, they're looking for a new sheriff now." The store erupted in worried murmurs. Ellie felt eyes turning toward her, some pitying, others dismissive. She heard someone whisper, "Just like what happened to Jim Matthews," and her hands clenched into fists. "Someone ought to do something," Tucker continued, arranging his wares. "But I suppose that's not the concern of a farm girl like yourself, miss." He nodded toward Ellie with what seemed like genuine kindness, though his words stung all the same. Ellie paid for her supplies quickly, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of fear and judgment. But as she stepped out onto the street, a familiar voice called out to her. "Ellie, wait up." Her mother, Sarah Matthews, hurried from the dressmaker's shop where she took in sewing work to help make ends meet. Her face was drawn with worry. "I heard about Copper Creek. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't try to—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Mama, I'm just getting supplies. That's all." "I know that look in your eyes, Ellie Matthews. It's the same one your father had." Sarah's voice caught. "We already lost him to those animals. I can't lose you too." The mention of her father sent Ellie's mind back to that terrible day 5 years ago. She'd been 14, watching from the hayloft as her father confronted 3 men trying to steal their horses. He'd been fast, but they'd been faster. The sound of those gunshots still echoed in her nightmares. "I promised to be careful, Mama," Ellie said softly, hugging her mother. But they both knew she hadn't promised what Sarah had actually asked. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Ellie stood before a simple wooden cross marking her father's grave. The small family plot sat atop a gentle rise behind their farm, offering a view of the lands he'd worked so hard to build into something lasting. "I don't know what to do, Pa," she whispered, kneeling to clear away some weeds that had sprung up around the base of the cross. "You always said we had to stand up to bullies, that backing down only makes them bolder. But you also taught me to protect our family." She touched the worn wood gently. "I'm trying to do both, but I don't know if I can." As if in answer, a cool breeze stirred the grass around her. Ellie stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and made her way to a secluded clearing she'd discovered years ago. Hidden from view by a stand of old oak trees, she'd set up her own private shooting range. Tin cans, bottles, and other targets were arranged at various distances, some barely visible to the untrained eye. Retrieving her father's rifle from its hiding place in a hollow log, Ellie took up position. Her movements now were nothing like the awkward display she'd put on for Ben. Each motion was smooth, practiced, perfect, just as her father had taught her in secret during those precious early morning hours before the rest of the family woke. The rifle cracked 6 times in rapid succession. 6 targets fell. She worked the action smoothly, her breathing controlled, and fired again. And again. Each shot found its mark, just as they had thousands of times before in this hidden place. As the last echo faded, Ellie lowered the rifle and closed her eyes, letting the familiar smell of gunpowder wash over her. Her father's words came back to her. "It's not about being the fastest or the strongest, Ellie. It's about being the smartest, the most patient. About knowing when to reveal your hand and when to keep it close." The sun was nearly gone now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. As Ellie made her way back toward the house, a movement on the distant horizon caught her eye. A cloud of dust was rising above the eastern road. Too much dust for a single rider, or even a small group. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. As she watched, the dust cloud grew larger, moving steadily closer to Sagebrush. Even at this distance, she could almost hear the thunder of approaching hooves. The Red Vultures were coming. The dust cloud Ellie had spotted the previous evening materialized into something far worse than anyone in Sagebrush could have imagined. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern hills when the first sounds of approaching horsemen reached the town. The steady drumbeat of hooves against packed earth grew louder with each passing moment, like distant thunder rolling ever closer. Kane Maddox and his Red Vultures appeared first as dark silhouettes against the rising sun, a technique they'd perfected to strike fear into the hearts of their victims. As they drew closer, details emerged from the dust and shadow. 15 riders spread across the width of the street, their horses moving in perfect unison. At their center rode Kane himself, a tall figure whose very posture seemed to radiate casual menace. The town had gone eerily quiet. Shopkeepers who'd been opening their stores for the day froze in their tracks. A woman hurriedly pulled her playing children inside. Even the usual morning bird song had fallen silent, as if nature itself held its breath. Kane Maddox reined his horse to a stop in the center of town, his gang forming a loose semicircle behind him. He cut an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and lean, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel set of his mouth and the cold calculation in his dark eyes. His black duster coat was immaculate despite the dusty ride, and a silver-plated revolver hung low on his hip. "Well, well," Kane's voice carried easily in the morning stillness, a hint of amusement coloring his words. "Looks like we've found ourselves another friendly little town." His gaze swept the street, taking in the modest buildings and nervous faces. "I do hope you'll all be more accommodating than our last hosts. Things got a mite messy in Copper Creek." From her position in the shadows between Tanner's general store and the cobbler's shop, Ellie watched as Kane's second-in-command, a wiry man with a face like weathered leather, dismounted with fluid grace. The man's right hand never strayed far from his holster, and his eyes held the predatory gleam of someone who enjoyed causing pain. The way the other bandits deferred to him marked him clearly as Kane's lieutenant. "Name's Trigger," he announced with a yellow-toothed grin. "Boss and I thought we'd come introduce ourselves proper-like, seeing as we might be spending some time in your fine establishment." He approached the nearest store, Peterson's Hardware, and tested the door. Finding it locked, he simply drove his boot through the front window. The sound of shattering glass seemed to break a spell. Several townspeople gasped or cried out, and Sheriff Monroe finally emerged from his office, his badge glinting weakly in the morning sun. But he moved like a man underwater, slow and hesitant, as Trigger began systematically smashing Mr. Peterson's carefully arranged window display. "Now see here," the sheriff's voice cracked slightly. "This is a peaceful town, and we don't want any—" "Shut up." Kane didn't raise his voice, but the command cracked like a whip. "The adults are talking." He turned to address the gathering crowd. "Here's how this works, friends. Every business in this charming little town is now under the protection of the Red Vultures. That protection costs money. Pay up, everyone stays healthy. Refuse." He gestured at the broken window. "Well, accidents do happen." Trigger had already moved on to the next store, kicking over a barrel of apples that rolled sadly down the dusty street. Other gang members dismounted and spread out, their boots clicking ominously on the wooden sidewalks as they began their systematic shakedown of the town's businesses. Two bandits entered Tanner's general store, and Ellie's hands clenched into fists as she heard Mrs. Tanner's frightened protests. Through the window, she could see them roughly shoving merchandise off shelves, their laughter mixing with the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. Across the street, old Mr. Hodges stood in the doorway of his small bookshop, his white hair catching the morning sun. Unlike the other merchants who were hurriedly digging out whatever money they could find, Mr. Hodges stood straight-backed and defiant. "I'll not pay a penny to thugs and murderers." His voice might have been frail, but it carried clearly. "My father built this shop, and his father before him helped found this town. We didn't bow to outlaws then, and I won't bow to them now." A hush fell over the street. Even the bandits paused in their ransacking to watch as Trigger slowly turned toward the bookshop. His spurs clinked with each deliberate step as he approached Mr. Hodges. "What did you say, old man?" Mr. Hodges lifted his chin. "You heard me, you cur." "I said." The sound of Trigger's backhand striking Mr. Hodges echoed off the buildings. The old man stumbled backward, losing his balance and falling hard onto the wooden sidewalk. A thin line of blood trickled from his split lip. Before she could think better of it, Ellie was moving. She crossed the street in long strides, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Reaching Mr. Hodges, she knelt beside him, one arm supporting his shoulders as she helped him sit up. "Are you all right, Mr. Hodges?" she asked softly, though her eyes never left Trigger. "Careful, girl," Mr. Hodges whispered. "Don't throw your life away on my account." Ellie helped him to his feet, positioning herself between the old man and Trigger. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the chill of a mountain stream in winter. "Back off." A moment of stunned silence followed her words, broken by Trigger's harsh laugh. "Well, look what we have here, boys. A regular guardian angel." His hand dropped casually to rest on his gun belt. "Though from the smell of her, I'd say she's just a farm girl who doesn't know her place." The other bandits joined in the laughter, their cruel mirth echoing off the buildings. Someone called out, "Better get back to your chickens, little girl." Another voice added, "Yeah, before you get yourself hurt." The little farm girl's got quite a mouth on her. Trigger sneered, taking a step closer. Maybe someone ought to teach her some manners. Kane Maddox had been watching the scene unfold with evident amusement. Now he guided his horse forward, the crowd parting before him like water. Now, Trigger. That's no way to treat a lady." His voice dripped false courtesy, especially one brave enough to stand up to the big, bad Red Vultures. He swung down from his saddle with casual grace, his spurs jingling as he approached Ellie. Though he stood nearly a head taller than her, she didn't back away. Her eyes met his steadily, and for a moment, something flickered in Kane's expression, a brief uncertainty, quickly masked. "What's your name, farm girl?" he asked, his tone conversational. "Ellie Matthews." A spark of recognition lit Kane's eyes. "Matthews? Now, why does that name sound familiar?" He made a show of thinking about it. "Ah, yes. Jim Matthews. Good man with a gun, if I recall. Right up until he wasn't." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "That was what, 5 years ago?" Ellie's face remained impassive, but her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Kane noticed, and his smile widened. "Let me give you some friendly advice, Miss Matthews," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Heroes don't tend to live very long in these parts. Just ask your father." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Or you would if you could." The street had gone deathly quiet. Everyone waited for Ellie to back down, to run away, to show some sign of fear. Instead, she held Kane's gaze, her green eyes boring into his with an intensity that made him blink first. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Maddox?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. Kane's smile faltered for just a moment. Something in her steady gaze unsettled him, though he couldn't say exactly what. It was like looking into the eyes of a wolf while expecting to find a rabbit. He recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Threatening you? Why? I'm trying to help you, girl. Teaching moments like these don't come along every day." He raised his voice to address the crowd. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. Courage is admirable, but it's also foolish. And foolish people tend to meet unfortunate ends." The townsfolk watched in tense silence, their fear a palpable thing. Mothers clutched their children close. Men stared at their boots, unable to meet Ellie's eyes. Only Mr. Hodges remained straight back behind her, his bloody lip beginning to swell. Kane turned back to Ellie, his voice dropping again. "Run along home now, farm girl. Go tend your chickens, and count yourself lucky I'm in a generous mood today." He reached out as if to pat her cheek condescendingly. Ellie didn't flinch or move away. Instead, she smiled, a small, cold expression that stopped Kane's hand mid-motion. For just a moment, their eyes locked again, and this time Kane took an unconscious step backward. "Everything all right, boss?" Trigger called out, his hand still hovering near his gun. Kane covered his momentary unease with a broad laugh. "Just fine, Trigger. Our little farm girl here was just leaving." He turned away dismissively, calling out to his men. "All right, boys, I think we've made our point for today. Let's ride." The Red Vultures remounted with practiced efficiency, their saddlebags heavier with the spoils of their morning's work. As they turned their horses toward the edge of town, Kane reined in beside Trigger. "Keep an eye on that one," he muttered, nodding toward Ellie. "There's something not right about her." Trigger spat in the dust. "Want me to take care of it?" "Not yet." Kane's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Let's see what she does first." The gang rode out much as they had arrived, in a cloud of dust and menace. Their laughter drifted back on the morning breeze, mixing with the thunder of hooves until both faded into silence. Only then did the tension begin to leak out of the town. People emerged from their hiding places, helping to clean up the mess the bandits had left behind. Sheriff Monroe slunk back to his office, avoiding everyone's eyes. Mrs. Tanner began sweeping up broken glass, her hands shaking slightly. Ellie stood in the street a moment longer, watching the dust cloud recede toward the horizon. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the hardest part of being strong is knowing when to wait." Well, she had waited long enough. She turned to help Mr. Hodges back into his shop, her mind already working through what needed to be done. The Red Vultures had shown their hand, revealed their numbers and their tactics. They thought they had found another easy target, another town too frightened to fight back. They were wrong. As she helped clean up the mess in Mr. Hodges' shop, Ellie's resolve hardened into something as unyielding as steel. The Red Vultures might have laughed at her today, dismissed her as just another farm girl, but their laughter wouldn't last. They had no idea what was coming. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the morning mist and the last traces of dust from the bandits' departure. A new day was dawning in Sagebrush, though few besides Ellie realized it yet. Change was coming, as inevitable as the sunrise. And change often began in the most unexpected places, like with a farm girl who wasn't quite what she seemed. The sun was setting by the time Ellie made her way home from town, casting long shadows across the familiar path. Her confrontation with Kane Maddox and his Red Vultures still burned in her mind, but the sound of determined grunts and the snap of a slingshot drew her attention as she approached the farmhouse. Ben stood in the side yard, his face scrunched in concentration as he took aim at a row of bottles he'd set up along the fence. His slingshot was drawn back, loaded with a smooth stone. With a sharp snap, he released it, and one of the bottles exploded in a satisfying crash. "Take that, you dirty bandits," he shouted, quickly loading another stone. Ellie paused to watch, her heart swelling with equal parts pride and concern. Ben's stance was better than it had been during their contest the day before, and his aim had improved notably. But there was something different in the way he practiced now, a fierce determination that seemed out of place on his usually cheerful face. "That's some fine shooting," she called out, making her presence known. Ben spun around, his face lighting up. "Ellie, is it true what they're saying? Did you really stand up to the Red Vultures?" He rushed over to her, practically bouncing with excitement. "Tommy Fletcher's pa came by earlier and said you faced down Kane Maddox himself." Ellie ruffled his hair affectionately. "Now don't you go believing everything you hear in town. I just helped Mr. Hodges up after he fell. That's all." "That's not what I heard," Ben persisted. "They say you didn't back down even when Kane threatened you. Just like Pa would have done." His eyes shone with admiration. "I want to be brave like that too. That's why I've been practicing extra hard." "Being brave isn't about looking for trouble, Ben," Ellie said softly, though her brother's words touched her deeply. "Sometimes it's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. Is that what you did today? Stood your ground?" Before Ellie could answer, their mother's voice called from the house. "Ben, Ellie, supper's getting cold." The evening passed quietly, though there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Their mother kept glancing at the windows, and even Ben's usually endless chatter seemed subdued. After helping with the dishes, Ellie checked all the doors and windows twice before retiring to her room. She lay awake for hours, listening to the night sounds of the farm, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cornfields, the occasional hoot of an owl. When sleep finally came, it was filled with troubled dreams of her father's last stand. The sound that woke her wasn't part of her dreams. Horses. Many horses moving fast and close. Ellie was on her feet and reaching for her clothes before she was fully awake. Through her window, she caught the flicker of torchlight moving toward the barn. Dark figures on horseback circled the structure, their shadows dancing grotesquely in the orange glow. "Ben," she whispered urgently, rushing to her brother's room. "Ben, wake up." But his bed was empty, the covers thrown back hastily. A high-pitched scream of terror split the night. Not human, but the frightened whinny of their best mare. It was followed by the deeper bellowing of cattle being driven from their pens, and then a sound that made Ellie's blood run cold. Ben's voice, raised in anger. "Get away from them. Leave our animals alone." Ellie ran down the stairs 3 at a time, her mother's frightened call following her. "Ellie! Ben! What's happening?" The night air hit her like a slap as she burst out the front door. The scene before her was chaos. Red vultures were everywhere, driving their terrified livestock out of the corrals while others threw burning torches onto the hay stored in the barn. The dry summer fodder caught quickly, sending flames racing up the wooden walls. And there was Ben, standing in front of the barn door with his slingshot raised, facing down 3 mounted bandits. "Look what we got here, boys." One of them laughed, the firelight revealing Trigger's cruel features. Another little hero in the making. Ben let fly with his slingshot. The stone struck Trigger's horse in the flank, causing it to rear up with a startled whinny. Trigger cursed, fighting to control his mount. "You little bastard," he snarled, drawing his pistol. "I'll teach you to." "Ben, get down." Ellie screamed, already running toward them. But she was too far away. Trigger swung down from his saddle, crossing the distance to Ben in 2 long strides. The back of his hand caught Ben across the face with enough force to lift the boy off his feet. Ben crashed hard into the side of the barn and crumpled to the ground, a cry of pain escaping his lips. "No!" Ellie's scream tore through the night as she reached her brother's side. Ben was conscious but dazed, blood streaming from his nose, and a cut above his eye where Trigger's ring had caught him. "Well, if it isn't our little farm girlfriend," Trigger sneered, looming over them. "Guess keeping her mouth shut doesn't run in the family." The barn was fully engulfed now, the heat intense against Ellie's back as she shielded Ben with her body. Their mother had appeared on the porch, her face pale in the firelight. "Consider this a reminder of our conversation this morning," Trigger said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Next time, we won't be so gentle." The bandits mounted up, driving their stolen livestock ahead of them as they rode off into the night. Their laughter mixed with the crackling of flames and the frightened lowing of cattle, a symphony of cruelty that burned itself into Ellie's memory. "Ben? Ben, can you hear me?" Ellie's hands trembled as she checked her brother's injuries. "I'm okay," he mumbled, trying to sit up. Did I hit him?" "Oh, Ben, Ellie pulled him close, tears streaming down her face. You brave, foolish boy. Their mother reached them then, and together they helped Ben into the house. While neighbors who'd seen the fire began arriving to help fight the blaze, Sarah Matthews cleaned and bandaged her son's wounds with gentle hands that only slightly betrayed their trembling. Hold still now, she murmured, dabbing at the cut above his eye. This needs stitches. Ben winced, but didn't pull away. I couldn't just let them take our animals, Mama. Pa wouldn't have let them. Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. Your father. She began, then stopped, swallowing hard. Pa would be proud of you, Ellie said firmly, holding Ben's hand. But he'd also want you to be smart about picking your battles. She squeezed his fingers gently. Promise me you won't do anything like that again. Ben's swollen face twisted in defiance. But you stood up to them in town. Everyone's talking about it. I'm older than you, Ben, and I didn't try to fight them alone in the dark. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, knowing what she was planning to do herself. By dawn, the barn was a smoking ruin. The morning light revealed the full extent of the damage: burned feed, damaged fencing, and missing livestock. Neighbors gathered to help assess the destruction, their faces grim, but their eyes avoiding Ellie's. Damn shame, Mr. Fletcher muttered, kicking at a charred beam. But what can you do? They're just too strong. We could fight back, Ben suggested from where he sat on the porch, his face badly bruised but his spirit unbroken. Hush now, Mrs. Fletcher said kindly. That kind of talk will only bring more trouble. Ellie listened to similar conversations throughout the morning, each one stoking the fire of rage burning in her chest. When she couldn't take it anymore, she saddled her horse and rode into town, determined to confront Sheriff Monroe. She found him sitting behind his desk, studiously examining wanted posters that were years out of date. He wouldn't meet her eyes as she entered. Sheriff, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. They attacked my family's farm last night, stole our livestock, hurt my brother, burned our barn. Monroe shuffled papers on his desk. I heard about that. Real shame. A shame? Ellie's hands clenched into fists. Is that all you have to say? What would you have me do? He burst out, finally looking up at her. There's 15 of them, all killers. I'm just one man, and not even a particularly good shot. His shoulders slumped. I took this job because nobody else wanted it, because it used to be easy. But now, so you'll do nothing? I'm sorry about your brother. Truly I am. But the best thing for everyone is to just give them what they want. Pay their protection money. Don't cause trouble. Ellie turned away in disgust, but Monroe's next words stopped her at the door. Your father was brave too, you know. Look where it got him. She left without responding, her boots clicking angrily on the wooden sidewalk as she made her way to Tanner's General Store. She needed supplies to repair the damaged fencing, though truthfully, she just needed to be doing something, anything, to keep from screaming in frustration. As she approached the store, voices drifted out through the open window. She recognized Kane Maddox's smooth drawl and froze in place, pressing herself against the wall beside the window. Like taking candy from a baby, Kane was saying, his voice thick with satisfaction. These people don't have the spine to stand against us. Nobody can touch the Red Vultures, not in this territory or any other. What about that Matthews girl? Another voice asked. She seemed different. Kane's laugh was dismissive. The farm girl? Please. She's just like her father. All talk and misplaced courage. And we all know how that ended. The words triggered a memory, so vivid it took Ellie's breath away. She was 14 again, the morning sun barely lighting the sky as her father led her to their secret shooting spot. The rifle felt heavy in her young hands, but his gentle guidance helped her hold it steady. Remember, Ellie, Jim Matthews said softly, adjusting her stance. It's not about being the strongest or the meanest. It's about being the smartest, the most patient. He helped her sight down the barrel at a distant target. And most importantly, it's about standing up for what's right, even when you're scared. Were you ever scared, Pa? Everyone gets scared, sweetheart. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done anyway. The memory faded, leaving Ellie with tears in her eyes and steel in her spine. She waited until Kane and his men had left the store before slipping away, an idea forming in her mind. The ruined barn held more than just ashes and charred timber. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had been the tack room, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay her father's old rifle, the one she'd been practicing with in secret all these years. The fire hadn't reached this corner of the barn, and the weapon was untouched. Ellie unwrapped it reverently, checking the action and barrel with practiced ease. It was still in perfect condition, just as she'd left it after her last practice session. Her father's initials were carved into the stock, along with words that had become her own private motto, "Stand true." That afternoon, she rode out alone, following the Red Vultures trail. She kept to the high ground, using the skills her father had taught her to remain unseen while she watched their camp through her father's old spyglass. She counted men, noted their patrol patterns, observed their routines. Kane's gang had set up in an abandoned silver mine about 5 miles outside of town. The entrance was well guarded, but Ellie discovered a higher vantage point that overlooked their entire camp. From there, she could see everything: where they kept their horses, where they stored their stolen goods, even where Kane himself liked to sit and smoke his evening cigar. As the sun began to set, Ellie made her way back home, her mind working through possibilities. The Red Vultures thought they were untouchable. They thought they could terrorize good people with impunity. They thought a farm girl couldn't possibly be a threat. They were wrong on all counts. That night, after checking on Ben one last time and kissing her mother goodnight, Ellie stood at her window, looking out toward the burned barn. The charred timbers stood like black bones against the starlit sky, a stark reminder of everything the Red Vultures had taken from her family, not just today, but 5 years ago as well. "I won't let them hurt anyone else, Pa," she whispered into the darkness. "I promise." Tomorrow, she would begin planning in earnest. The Red Vultures had shown their true colors, crossing a line from which there was no return. Now it was time for Ellie to show her own true nature, not just the farm girl they all saw, but the deadly marksman her father had trained her to be. The night wind carried the scent of smoke from the ruined barn, mixing with the sweet summer air. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, a lonely, haunting sound that seemed to echo Ellie's own determination. The Red Vultures had no idea what they'd awakened, but they would learn soon enough. The morning after her reconnaissance of the Red Vultures' hideout, Ellie knew she couldn't face this fight alone. She needed allies, people she could trust, people with skills, and most importantly, people with the courage to stand against Kane Maddox and his gang. Her first stop was the sheriff's office, but not to see Sheriff Monroe. Instead, she sought out Deputy Sam Cooper, a young man who'd only recently pinned on his badge. She found him exactly where she expected, practicing his draw behind the jail, away from the sheriff's disapproving eyes. "Your grip's too tight," Ellie said quietly, causing Sam to start. "Makes your hand shake when you pull the trigger." Sam holstered his revolver, his face reddening. "Miss Matthews, I didn't see you there." He shuffled his feet, embarrassed to be caught practicing. "About what happened at your farm? I wanted to help, but the sheriff—" "I know," Ellie cut him off. "That's why I'm here to talk to you, not him." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "How would you like to actually make a difference in this town?" Sam's eyes lit up with interest, but caution kept his voice low. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Meet me at Carter's gunsmith shop in an hour. Bring your revolver." Her next stop was the gunsmith shop itself, where old Mr. Carter was working at his bench, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision as he cleaned a customer's rifle. The bell above the door announced her entrance, but he didn't look up from his work. "If you're here about the Red Vultures' protection money, I already paid," he said gruffly. "Actually, Mr. Carter, I'm here about my father's rifle." They got his attention. The old gunsmith's head snapped up, his keen eyes studying her face. "Jim Matthews Winchester? Haven't seen that piece in years. Fine weapon. Custom sights, if I remember correctly. You should remember. You installed them yourself." A ghost of a smile crossed Carter's face. "So I did. Your father was particular about those sights. Said they had to be perfect for teaching his little girl to shoot." He set down his tools. "Though I don't recall ever seeing you shoot. That's because Pa wanted it kept quiet. Said a secret advantage is better than a known one." Carter nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Smart man, your father." He glanced around his empty shop before continuing. "I suppose you're not here just to reminisce about old times." "No, sir. I'm here because I need your help." And because I remember Pa saying you were the best shot in 3 counties before your hands started giving you trouble. These old hands might not be steady enough for shooting anymore, Carter admitted, flexing his fingers. But they can still teach others how to shoot straight. He studied her for a long moment. You're planning something foolish, aren't you? Yes, sir. Want to help? His answering smile was fierce. Thought you'd never ask. Their final recruit came looking for them. Will Tucker, the 16-year-old son of the traveling peddler who'd warned them about Copper Creek, burst into Carter's shop just as Ellie was explaining her idea to Sam and the gunsmith. I want in, he declared, his young face flushed with excitement. Whatever you're planning against the Red Vultures, I want to help. This isn't a game, boy, Carter growled. Go home. But Ellie held up her hand, studying Will thoughtfully. How did you know we were planning something? Been watching you since yesterday, Will admitted. Saw you tracking the gang back to their hideout. I can help. I know these hills better than anyone. Been exploring them while Pa trades in town. Ellie exchanged looks with Carter and Sam. The boy was young, but his knowledge of the terrain could be invaluable. And there was a determined set to his jaw that reminded her of Ben. All right, she said finally. But you follow orders exactly, understand? No heroics. Will's face split into a grin. Yes, ma'am. With her core team assembled, Ellie led them to her secret practicing spot. The familiar clearing looked different somehow with others present, like a private sanctuary open to the world. But when she raised her father's rifle and proceeded to hit 6 targets in rapid succession, including ones barely visible in the deepening shadows, the sanctuary became something else, a place of revelation. Sweet Jesus, Sam breathed, his eyes wide. Where did you learn to shoot like that? My father taught me, starting when I was 12, Ellie explained, lowering the rifle. We practiced every morning before dawn, right up until... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jim Matthews trained you well, Carter nodded approvingly. Better than well. You're a natural marksman, or markswoman, I should say. Will was practically bouncing with excitement. This is perfect. The Red Vultures won't expect anything like this. A girl who can outshoot their whole gang? It's brilliant. Over the next several days, they fell into a routine. Mornings were spent observing the Red Vultures, learning their patterns. Will's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable. He knew every hidden trail and vantage point around their hideout. They send out 3-man patrols every morning, Will reported, sketching a rough map in the dirt. Always follow the same routes, always at the same times. Getting lazy, overconfident, Carter corrected. That's good for us. Means they'll be easier to surprise. Afternoons were dedicated to training. Carter might not have been able to shoot anymore, but his knowledge of marksmanship was encyclopedic. Under his guidance, Sam's accuracy improved dramatically, and even Will showed promise with a rifle. Remember, Carter instructed as they practiced, breathing is everything. Control your breath. Control your shot. They set up elaborate practice scenarios, using Carter's shop after hours to simulate different tactical situations. Ellie's plan was taking shape. They would ambush one of the morning patrols, using the terrain to their advantage. We'll need to be perfect, she stressed during one planning session. One mistake could get us all killed. We'll be ready, Sam assured her, his confidence growing with each successful practice session. One evening, as Ellie was cleaning her rifle at the kitchen table, her mother sat down across from her. Sarah Matthews' face was lined with worry, but there was understanding in her eyes. You're planning something dangerous, aren't you? She asked quietly. Ellie's hands stilled on the rifle. Yes, Mama. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching her daughter's sure movements as she resumed cleaning the weapon. Your father would be proud of you, she said finally, and terrified for you, just like I am. I have to do this, Mama. For Ben. For Pa. For everyone they've hurt. I know. Sarah reached across the table, covering Ellie's hand with her own. Just promise me you'll be careful. I can't lose you too. I promise, Mama. And I'm not alone. I have help. Good people who want to fight back too. What neither of them knew was that at that very moment, one of Kane's spies was rushing to the Red Vultures' hideout with troubling news. Jasper Tate, a drifter who'd been hanging around Sagebrush for the past week, had noticed the regular meetings at Carter's shop. Something's brewing, boss, he reported to Kane. That Matthews girl's up to something. Been meeting with the deputy, old Carter, and some others. Kane's face darkened with anger. I knew that girl would be trouble. Time to send another message, I think. But before he could act on his threat, Ellie's group was already putting the final touches on their plan. They staged a full dress rehearsal in the pre-dawn hours, working out timing and positioning. Will, you'll be our lookout here. Ellie indicated a spot on their rough map. Sam, you'll take position on this ridge. I'll be up there. She pointed to a higher outcropping. When the patrol reaches this point, we spring the trap. They practiced until every movement was smooth, every position perfect. But Ellie knew they needed more than just tactical preparation. They needed the town's support, or at least their silence. The next day, she spoke at an impromptu gathering behind the general store. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly to every ear. I know you're afraid, she told the assembled townsfolk. The Red Vultures want us to be afraid. But fear is their only real power over us. They're not invincible. They're just men, cruel men who prey on those they think won't fight back. Easy for you to say, someone called out. You haven't lost everything to them yet. Haven't I? Ellie's voice hardened. They killed my father, burned our barn, hurt my brother. But I'm still standing. We're all still standing. She looked around the crowd, meeting eyes one by one. We don't have to fight them directly. Just don't help them. Don't warn them. Don't spy for them. Give us a chance to show you that they can be beaten. Her words struck a chord. Though few openly supported her, she saw hope kindle in many eyes. It was enough for now. The night before their planned ambush, Ellie's small team gathered in Carter's shop for final preparations. The old gunsmith had worked late into the previous night, ensuring every weapon was cleaned and perfectly sighted. Remember your training, he told them gruffly, though pride shone in his eyes. Stay calm. Breathe steady. Make every shot count. Sam checked his revolver one last time, his hands now rock steady. We won't let you down, Mr. Carter. What was unusually quiet, the reality of what they were about to do finally sinking in. Ellie put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to come tomorrow. No one will think less of you. The boy straightened his spine. I'm coming. Someone has to show them that not everyone in this territory is afraid. As the others made their final preparations, Ellie took a moment to step outside. The night was clear and cool, stars gleaming like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Somewhere out there, the Red Vultures were probably sitting around their campfire, laughing, confident in their power over the weak and fearful. Tomorrow, that would change. She thought of Ben, his face still bruised but healing, his spirit unbroken. She thought of her father, teaching her patience and precision in the quiet dawn hours. She thought of her mother's quiet strength, supporting her even through her fear. The dawn would bring violence. There was no avoiding that. But it would also bring hope. Hope that the Red Vultures could be beaten. Hope that good people could stand up to evil and win. As if reading her thoughts, Carter appeared in the doorway behind her. It's time, he said softly. Best get some rest. Tomorrow comes early. Ellie nodded, taking one last look at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. Their plan was solid, their preparations thorough, their resolve unshaken. The Red Vultures had laughed at the farm girl who dared to stand up to them. After tomorrow, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. In ones and twos, her small team slipped away into the night, each heading home to grab what little sleep they could before their pre-dawn meeting. Their paths would converge again in just a few hours, leading them toward a confrontation that would either break the Red Vulture's grip on Sagebrush or end in tragedy. Ellie was the last to leave, pausing only to check her father's rifle one final time. The worn stock felt familiar under her hands, the weight comforting. His initials caught the lamplight, along with those words that had become her guiding star. Stand true. Tomorrow, she would do exactly that. Tomorrow, the Red Vultures would learn that they had underestimated not just her, but the strength that comes from standing together against tyranny. The night wrapped around her like a cloak as she made her way home, her steps sure and purposeful. In just a few hours, everything would change. They were ready. The pre-dawn air was crisp and still as Ellie and her team took their positions around the Red Vulture's outpost. A thin mist clung to the ground, providing additional cover as they moved silently through the darkness. Will had been right. The bandits had grown complacent, maintaining the same predictable patrol patterns day after day. From her elevated position behind a cluster of rocks, Ellie could see everything. The outpost was little more than a crude shelter and corral where the gang kept their stolen livestock before moving them to their main camp. 3 bandits sat around a dying campfire, passing a bottle between them. 2 more were saddling their horses, preparing for the morning patrol. Through her father's spyglass, Ellie recognized Trigger among them, his weather-beaten face illuminated by the fire's dim glow. Her jaw tightened at the memory of him striking Ben, but she pushed the anger aside. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Cool heads make clean shots. She raised her hand, signaling to Sam and Will in their hidden positions. Everything was ready. Now they just had to wait for the perfect moment. The sky was beginning to lighten, painting the eastern horizon in pale gold, when 2 of the bandits mounted up to begin their patrol. This was what they'd been waiting for. The group would be split, making them easier to handle. Ellie's rifle came up smoothly, settling against her shoulder like an old friend. Through the scope, she could see every detail of her first target, the bandit by the fire who just stood up to stretch, presenting a perfect shot. She took a slow, measured breath, then squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report shattered the morning silence. The stretching bandit dropped without a sound, a look of surprise frozen on his face. Before the others could even register what had happened, Ellie's second shot caught another bandit as he reached for his gun. Ambush! Trigger's voice rang out, but his warning came too late. Sam opened fire from his position, forcing the mounted bandits to dive from their horses for cover. Will's job was to keep the horses from bolting, firing carefully placed shots that sent the animals running in the direction they wanted, away from the Red Vultures' main camp. One of the bandits tried to make a run for better cover. Ellie's third shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Her fourth shot struck the ground near another bandit's head as he tried to peek out from behind a water barrel, sending him scrambling back with a yelp of terror. "It's coming from the rocks," someone shouted. "There's only one shooter up there." Trigger seized the opportunity, breaking cover to make a run for his horse. Fall back. Fall back to the main camp." Ellie drew a bead on him, but had to shift her aim as one of the other bandits opened fire on her position, bullets sparking off the rocks around her. By the time she could safely take another shot, Trigger had mounted and was galloping away, leaving his remaining men behind. The 2 surviving bandits, seeing their leader flee, threw down their weapons. "Don't shoot. We give up. Sam, Will," Ellie called out. "Secure them." As her teammates moved in to tie up the surrendered bandits, Ellie maintained her elevated position, rifle ready in case this was a trick. But the fight had gone out of the survivors. They looked shell-shocked, unable to believe what had just happened. "Who are you people?" one of them asked as Sam bound his hands. "Just folks who got tired of being afraid," Sam answered, tightening the ropes. Will was practically vibrating with excitement as he helped round up the dropped weapons. "Did you see that shooting? 3 perfect shots in less than 10 seconds. Wait till people hear about this." "Calm down," Ellie called as she made her way down from her position. "We're not done yet. Well, get those horses rounded up. Sam, help me secure these prisoners. We need to get back to town before Trigger brings reinforcements." They worked quickly, gathering up weapons and ammunition while Will collected the scattered horses. The 2 prisoners were secured on their own mounts, hands tied to their saddle horns. The 3rd wounded bandit was conscious but sullen as Sam bandaged his shoulder. "You should have killed me," he growled at Ellie. "That's not who we are," she replied simply. "But cross us again, and that might change." The ride back to Sagebrush was tense, everyone expecting to hear pursuing hoofbeats at any moment. But they made it without incident, the morning sun now fully risen as they rode down the main street. The sight of Ellie's group escorting bound Red Vultures drew townsfolk from their homes and businesses. Whispers spread quickly through the gathering crowd. "Is that really Ellie Matthews? They captured Red Vultures. Look at all those horses they recovered. But how did they?" Mr. Carter was waiting at the jail, his weathered face breaking into a fierce grin as they approached. "Well done. Though I expect we'll have company soon enough. Help Sam secure the prisoners," Ellie ordered, dismounting. "We'll get those stolen horses to the livery stable. We'll sort out who they belong to later." As her team carried out their tasks, more townsfolk gathered, their initial shock giving way to cautious celebration. Mrs. Tanner pushed through the crowd to press a fresh loaf of bread into Ellie's hands. "You did it," she said, tears in her eyes. "You actually stood up to them." But Ellie wasn't celebrating. Her mind was already working through what would come next. "This was just the beginning," she warned. "Kane won't take this lying down. We need to be ready." Meanwhile, at the Red Vultures' main camp, Trigger's arrival had caused an uproar. He burst into Kane's tent, still breathless from his hard ride. "We were ambushed," he reported between gasping breaths. "Professional job. They knew exactly when to hit us and where to set up." Kane's face darkened. "How many attackers?" "3, maybe 4. But there was one shooter." Trigger shook his head in disbelief. "Never seen anything like it. 3 kills in seconds, all perfect shots. They knew our patrol schedule, knew the terrain." "The Matthews girl," Kane growled. "Had to be. Jim Matthews was a crack shot. Must have taught his daughter before we killed him." He hurled his coffee cup against the tent pole. "I knew we should have finished that whole family when we had the chance. Maybe we should pull back," his lieutenant suggested carefully. "Find easier territory. These people seem—" Kane's hand shot out, grabbing the man's shirt front. "Pull back?" From a farm girl and a few townsfolk. He shoved the lieutenant away in disgust. No, we're going to teach them exactly why people fear the Red Vultures. Gather the men. All of them." Back in Sagebrush, Ellie's team was putting their victory to good use. Word of their successful ambush had broken through the town's shell of fear, and volunteers were stepping forward to help. "I can shoot," declared Mr. Peterson from the hardware store. "Was in the army before settling here. Just needed a reminder that standing up is worth the risk." Others followed his lead. By midday, Ellie had a dozen new volunteers, each bringing different skills to the fight. The blacksmith offered to forge additional ammunition. The carpenter and his apprentices began working on defensive positions. Under Ellie and Carter's direction, they began fortifying the town. Strategic buildings were reinforced, firing positions established, escape routes planned. They turned the general store's solid brick walls into a strong point, the church steeple into a sniper's nest. "See how these barrels create a crossfire?" Ellie explained to a group of volunteers. "Anyone coming down the main street will have to run a gauntlet." The work continued through the afternoon, the town coming together with a sense of purpose many had thought lost. Even Sheriff Monroe emerged from his office to observe, though he kept his distance. During a brief break, Ellie found Ben watching the preparations with burning eyes. "Teach me," he said simply. "Really teach me like Pa taught you." Ellie studied her brother's face. The bruises from Trigger's attack were fading, but the determination in his eyes was stronger than ever. "All right," she agreed finally. "But we do this my way. No rushing and half-cocked." They went to her practice clearing, where she began with the basics: stance, breathing, trigger control. Ben proved an apt pupil, soaking up every detail. "Remember what Pa always said?" Ellie instructed as she adjusted his grip on the rifle. "Patience beats speed every time." "Is that how you got so good?" Ben asked, squeezing off a careful shot that struck near the center of his target. "Partly, but mostly it was practicing every day, no matter what. Pa used to say that skill is just dedication wearing a fancy hat." They worked together until the sun began to set, their shared focus on marksmanship bringing them closer than ever. Ben's progress was remarkable. By the end of their session, he was grouping his shots consistently. "You're a natural," Ellie praised, ruffling his hair. "Pa would be proud." "Thanks, Ellie." Ben's voice was quiet but firm. "Not just for teaching me, but for showing everyone we don't have to be afraid anymore." Their moment was interrupted by the distant sound of a horn, the warning signal they'd established. 3 long blasts. Riders approaching from the direction of the Red Vultures' camp. "Come on," Ellie said, slinging her rifle over her shoulder. "Time to see if our preparations pay off." They rushed back to town, where Sam met them with grim news. "Scouts spotted at least 20 riders," he reported. "Kane's called in reinforcements. They'll be here by morning." The town buzzed with nervous energy as people hurried to complete their defensive preparations. Families moved to designated safe houses. Volunteers took up their assigned positions. Weapons were distributed and checked one final time. Ellie walked the defensive line, checking positions and offering encouragement. The fear was still there in people's eyes, but now it was tempered with resolution. They had tasted victory, remembered what it felt like to stand tall. As darkness fell, the town grew quiet except for the soft footsteps of posted sentries. Ellie climbed to the church steeple, her designated position for the coming battle, and looked out over the darkened landscape. Somewhere out there, Kane and his Red Vultures were preparing for their attack. The night wind carried the smell of sage and dust, along with the distant howl of a coyote. Below her, the town's lights burned low but steady, like the courage of its people, not flashy or bold, but enduring. Will appeared at the top of the steeple stairs, slightly out of breath. Everything's ready. Mr. Carter says to remind you about watching the sun angle in the morning. It'll be in the attacker's eyes. Ellie nodded, remembering her father teaching her the same lesson. Get some rest, Will. Tomorrow will be here soon enough. But rest wouldn't come easily to anyone that night. The air was thick with anticipation, every sound magnified in the darkness. The victory of the morning felt distant now, overshadowed by the knowledge that they faced a much greater challenge ahead. In the Red Vultures camp, Kane stood over a crude map of sagebrush, planning his assault. His face was hard in the lamplight as he issued orders to his gathered men. I want that town to serve as an example, he growled. By sunset tomorrow, everyone in the territory will know what happens to those who defy the Red Vultures. The night crept on, stars wheeling overhead as two forces prepared to clash. In Sagebrush, Ellie made one final round of the defenses near midnight. The volunteers at their posts nodded to her silently, their faces showing a mix of fear and determination. At the general store, now converted into a strong point, she found Carter checking ammunition supplies. Get some sleep, the old gunsmith advised. You'll need steady hands tomorrow. I will, she promised. Just one more thing to check. But they both knew she wouldn't rest, not really. Too much rode on what would happen when the sun rose. The lives of everyone in town, the memory of her father, the future of the entire territory, all would be decided in the coming battle. As she climbed back to her position in the steeple, Ellie touched the stock of her father's rifle, drawing strength from the familiar wood grain. The inscription caught the moonlight. Stand true. Tomorrow would test that promise to its limit. The Red Vultures were coming in force, determined to crush this uprising before it could spread. They would attack with everything they had, expecting to find a town of frightened sheep. Instead, they would find wolves. The first light of dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when Will's warning whistle cut through the morning stillness. From her position in the church steeple, Ellie could see the Red Vultures approaching, not in their usual swaggering formation, but spread out in a wide attack line. Kane had clearly learned from their earlier encounter. Here they come, she whispered into the quiet. Everyone hold steady. The town appeared deserted, windows shuttered and streets empty. But behind those shutters, inside those buildings, dozens of townspeople waited with weapons ready. Their fear was palpable, but so was their determination. Kane's voice boomed across the empty street. Last chance, farm girl. Send out the ones responsible for this morning's ambush, and the rest might live. Ellie's response was a single rifle shot that knocked Kane's hat from his head. The gang leader ducked instinctively, his face contorting with rage. Kill them all, he roared. Burn this town to the ground. The Red Vultures charged forward with a thunderous chorus of hoofbeats and war cries. But as they reached the first line of buildings, Ellie's carefully planned defenses sprang to life. Hidden defenders opened fire from multiple positions, catching the riders in a deadly crossfire. 3 bandits fell in the first volley. Others scrambled for cover as bullets sparked off the dusty street around them. The initial charge dissolved into chaos as the gang realized they'd ridden into a trap. Groups of 2. Kane shouted to his men. Find those shooters. Ellie's rifle cracked again and again from the steeple, each shot finding its mark. Her elevated position gave her a perfect view of the unfolding battle, allowing her to direct defenders and pick off any bandits who exposed themselves. Sam, she called out. They're trying to flank around Peterson's store. Deputy Sam Cooper led a small team to reinforce the threatened position. They arrived just as 2 bandits were attempting to break in through a back window. The ensuing firefight was brief but intense. A bullet creased Sam's arm, drawing blood. He stumbled, nearly dropping his gun, but Ellie's voice rang out from above. Remember your training, Sam? Just like we practiced. The young deputy steadied himself, remembering Carter's lessons about breathing through the pain. His next 2 shots dropped both attackers. "Good shooting," Ellie called down. "Now fall back to the store." They're regrouping for another push. The battle shifted as the Red Vultures adapted to the town's defenses. They began using mounted hit-and-run attacks, trying to draw out the defenders. But old Mr. Carter had anticipated this tactic. "Wait for them to commit." His voice carried from his position in the general store. "Don't waste ammunition on moving targets." The wisdom of his words was proven moments later when a group of bandits charged the general store directly. The defenders held their fire until the last moment, then unleashed a devastating volley at point-blank range. But one rider made it through, crashing his horse directly through the store's front window. In the chaos that followed, Mr. Carter found himself facing down the bandit's drawn revolver. Time seemed to slow as the old gunsmith realized he couldn't reach his weapon in time. Behind the bandit, he could see several townspeople, including 2 young children who had been using the store as a shelter. They were exposed, defenseless. Without hesitation, Carter threw himself forward. The bandit's gun roared twice. The old gunsmith's body jerked with the impacts, but his momentum carried him into his attacker, bearing them both to the ground. The townspeople scrambled to safety as Carter wrestled with the bandit, his strength fading, but his grip unwavering. "Run," he gasped. "Get to the back room." Ellie saw the struggle through her scope, but couldn't get a clear shot. "Carter," she screamed, but it was too late. A 3rd shot rang out. Carter's body went limp. The bang of Ellie's rifle was nearly lost in the general chaos, but her bullet found the bandit with lethal accuracy as he tried to rise. He collapsed across Carter's body, both men lying still in the shattered glass and splintered wood. "Mr. Carter's down." Will's voice cracked with emotion. "What do we do?" "We keep fighting." Ellie's voice carried across the town, steady and strong despite her grief. "It's what he'd want. Hold your positions." The battle raged on, but Carter's death marked a turning point. The townsfolk fought with renewed fury, their initial fear transformed into righteous anger. Every position Carter had helped plan, every lesson he'd taught, became a tribute to his sacrifice. Through her scope, Ellie spotted Trigger leading a group of bandits toward the church. His face was twisted with malice as he pointed up at her position. "There's the one we want. Take her down." Bullets whined past the steeple as Ellie ducked behind cover. When she peered out again, Trigger was nowhere to be seen. But movement at the church's side door caught her attention. He was trying to reach her position directly. Ellie quickly reloaded, her movements calm despite the danger. She could hear Trigger's boots on the stairs now, his spurs jingling with each step. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the best shot is the one you wait for." The steeple had only one entrance. Ellie trained her rifle on the top of the stairs and waited. Trigger burst up the last few steps, guns blazing. But Ellie had already rolled to her secondary position. Her single shot caught him in the chest, the impact throwing him back against the wall. "That's for my brother," she said coldly as Trigger slid to the floor, his guns clattering from lifeless hands. The news of Trigger's death spread quickly through the Red Vultures' ranks. He had been Kane's right hand, his most feared enforcer. If he could fall, anyone could. "It's just one girl." Kane raged, seeing his men's confidence waver. "One goddamn farm girl." But his words had little effect. More bandits were falling back, retreating toward the town's edges. The tide was turning. Then Kane spotted an opportunity. Mrs. Tanner and several other townspeople making a dash between buildings. With a snarl of triumph, he spurred his horse forward, cutting off their escape. "Drop your weapons," he roared, pressing his gun to Mrs. Tanner's head. "All of you, or I start killing hostages." The gunfire gradually ceased as defenders realized the situation. Kane had positioned himself well, using the hostages as shields while keeping clear of Ellie's sniper position. "Show yourself, Matthews," he called out, "or their deaths are on your hands." Ellie's mind raced as she assessed the situation. Kane had 5 hostages, including Mrs. Tanner. He was partially sheltered by the hardware store's awning, making any shot from her position nearly impossible. But she had planned for something like this. "Will," she whispered into the quiet. "The barrel signal, just like we practiced." Off to her right, Will carefully took aim at a stack of barrels they'd positioned days earlier. His shot struck true, sending them crashing into the street. The noise drew Kane's attention for just a fraction of a second, but that was all Sam needed. The deputy had been slowly working his way around through the buildings. As Kane turned toward the noise, Sam crashed through a window behind him, tackling him from his horse. The hostages scattered as the two men rolled in the dust. Kane managed to keep his grip on his gun, bringing it around toward Sam. But Ellie's shot knocked the weapon from his hand in a spray of blood and broken fingers. "It's over, Kane," she called out. "Call off your men." The gang leader looked around wildly, seeing his forces in retreat, his lieutenant dead, his hostage gambit failed. For a moment, pure hatred twisted his features. "This isn't over, farm girl," he snarled, clutching his bleeding hand. "I'll be back, and next time—" Another shot from Ellie's rifle kicked up dust inches from his feet. "Next time will be your last," she promised. "Now get out of our town." Kane scrambled backward, then turned and ran for his horse. What remained of his gang was already fleeing, their fearsome reputation shattered by the resistance of one small town. As the thunder of retreating hoofbeats faded, a strange silence fell over Sagebrush. Then someone started cheering. Others joined in, the sound swelling as people emerged from their defensive positions. Ellie made her way down from the steeple on shaking legs, the events of the battle catching up with her. Sam met her at the bottom of the stairs, his arm crudely bandaged but his face beaming with pride. "We did it," he said simply. "We actually did it." The celebration was tempered by grief as they gathered their dead and wounded. Mr. Carter's body was carried reverently from the general store, his weathered face peaceful despite his violent end. Other townspeople had been wounded, but thanks to their preparation and Carter's planning, no one else had been killed. Mrs. Tanner approached Ellie as they began cleaning up the battlefield. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for showing us we could fight back." Ellie accepted the woman's hug, but her mind was already working through what needed to be done next. Kane's threat echoed in her ears. This wasn't over. "We'll need to post guards," she told Sam, "day and night. Kane won't take this defeat easily." "We'll be ready," Sam assured her. "The whole town's behind you now." As if to prove his point, townspeople were already starting to rebuild, working together to repair damage from the battle. Others were organizing hunting parties to recover stolen livestock and supplies from the Red Vultures' abandoned camp. Will join them, his young face streaked with tears and dirt. "Mr. Carter, he died protecting those kids. He was a hero." "Yes, he was," Ellie agreed quietly. "And we'll honor his sacrifice by keeping this town safe." The sun climbed higher in the sky as Sagebrush began to recover from the battle. The air still smelled of gun smoke, and bullet holes pocked the buildings. But there was a new feeling in the town, pride, mixed with determination. They had stood against the Red Vultures and won. But Ellie knew better than to celebrate too soon. Kane was still out there, nursing his wounds and his wounded pride. He would return, probably with even more men. But when he did, he wouldn't find a town of frightened victims. He would find a community united, ready to defend what was theirs. And he would find Ellie Matthews waiting for him, her father's rifle in hand and Carter's final lessons in her heart. The Red Vultures had laughed at a farm girl once. They weren't laughing anymore. As the townspeople continued their cleanup efforts, Ellie climbed back up to her position in the steeple. From there, she could watch the horizon where Kane had disappeared, ready for whatever came next. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Ellie noticed something was wrong. Ben's bed was empty, the covers thrown back carelessly. His morning chores remained undone, something her responsible brother would never allow. "Maybe he went to practice early," Sarah Matthews suggested, but the worry in her voice betrayed her true thoughts. Ellie was already pulling on her boots when Will came running up to their farm, out of breath and clutching a blood-stained piece of paper. "Found this, nailed to the church door," he gasped, handing it to her with trembling hands. The message was brief, written in a harsh scrawl. "To the farm girl who thinks she's a hero. Your brother was practicing his shooting, just like his big sister taught him. Brave kid. Stupid, but brave. Just like your father was. Want him back? Come to Silver Creek Mine. Alone. Any sign of your town friends, and little Ben won't live to see another sunrise. Time to finish what we started. Kane." A few drops of blood stained the corner of the paper. Not much, but enough to make Ellie's hands shake with barely controlled rage. "I'll gather the men," Will said, already turning toward town. "We can surround the mine like we did with the outpost." "No." Ellie's voice was cold as steel. "You read the note. He wants me alone? It's obviously a trap." "Of course it's a trap." She folded the bloodstained note carefully, tucking it into her shirt pocket. "But Kane made one mistake. He gave me time to prepare." Back in town, news of Ben's kidnapping spread quickly. Sam burst into the sheriff's office as Ellie was checking her ammunition. "Let me help," he pleaded. "We can position shooters on the ridges above the mine. Kane would never know. And if he does?" Ellie met his eyes steadily. "If he does, Ben dies. I won't risk it. Then at least let me ride with you part way. As backup." "No, Sam." She softened her tone. "I need you here. If something goes wrong, the town will need protection." More volunteers arrived, each offering help, each having to be turned away. Will was particularly persistent. "I know those mines better than anyone," he insisted. "There are back entrances Kane probably doesn't even know exist." But Ellie stood firm. The stakes were too high for risks. She spent the next hour preparing methodically, just as her father had taught her. She cleaned her weapons, counted ammunition, studied the crude map Will had drawn of the mine's layout. But her mind kept drifting to Ben, his determination to learn shooting, his bravery during the barn burning, his unfailing faith in his big sister. "I should have protected him better," she whispered, guilt gnawing at her heart. "Stop that right now." Her mother's voice made her turn. Sarah Matthews stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "This isn't your fault. It's Kane's, and you're going to make him regret it." "I'm scared, Mama," Ellie admitted, finally voicing the fear that had been growing inside her. "What if I can't save him? What if I lose him like we lost Pa?" Sarah crossed the room and pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. "Listen to me, Ellie Matthews. You're not going to lose. You know why? Because you're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for Ben, for this town, for everything your father believed in." When they separated, both women's eyes were dry. Sarah helped Ellie finish her preparations, checking every detail with a mother's careful attention. The ride to Silver Creek Mine took just over an hour. Ellie used the time to center herself, remembering everything her father and Carter had taught her. She thought about Kane, about his need for revenge, about how he'd want to savor this moment. That would be his weakness. The mine came into view, a dark wound in the mountainside, its abandoned equipment casting long shadows in the morning light. Ellie dismounted a fair distance away, studying the approach through her father's spyglass. 2 guards at the main entrance, visible and obvious. Others would be hidden, watching her approach. But Kane would want her to come in. This part, at least, wouldn't be a fight. She thought about Ben inside that dark mine, probably scared but trying not to show it, just like their father would have done. The thought strengthened her resolve. Moving with deliberate calm, she approached the mine entrance. The guard spotted her immediately. "That's far enough," one called out. "Drop your weapons." Ellie complied, carefully laying her father's rifle and gun belt on the ground. But as they moved to search her, she allowed herself a small, cold smile. They didn't know about the derringer hidden in her boot, the one Carter had given her for insurance. The guards led her into the mine, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The main tunnel was wider than she'd expected, reinforced with heavy timber supports. Side passages branched off at irregular intervals, disappearing into darkness. Ellie memorized every turn, every crossroads, building a mental map as they went deeper. She counted steps, noted landmarks, identified potential cover. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "In a fight, knowing your ground is as important as knowing your gun." After about 100 yards, they reached a larger chamber. Mining equipment and old crates were scattered around, creating plenty of cover. More of Kane's men, she counted 8, were positioned strategically around the space. And there, in the center of it all, stood Kane himself. One hand rested on Ben's shoulder, the other held a revolver to the boy's head. Ben's face was bruised, and his hands were tied, but his eyes lit up with hope when he saw his sister. "Welcome to my humble home," Kane said, his voice echoing in the chamber. I trust you came alone? Let him go, Kane, Ellie replied evenly. This is between you and me. Kane's laugh was ugly. Oh, but this is so much better. The brave big sister, coming to save her little brother. Just like a dime novel. His voice hardened. Except in real life, heroes die. Just like your father did. But while Kane was talking, Ellie was noting positions, angles, distances. The Derringer would give her 2 shots. She needed to make them count. After that, you know what your biggest mistake was, Kane? She asked conversationally, taking a small step to her left. Enlighten me, he sneered. Ellie's eyes met Ben's. In that moment, without words, sister and brother shared the same thought, the same lesson their father had taught them both. Sometimes the hardest part of being strong is knowing when to wait. Your biggest mistake, Ellie said softly, her hand inches from her hidden weapon, was giving me time to plan. The chamber grew deathly quiet, the air thick with tension. In the flickering lamplight, shadows danced across faces both determined and desperate. The story of the farm girl and the bandits had come full circle, back to another moment when everything hung in the balance. But this time would be different. This time, she was ready. Kane's laughter echoed through the mine chamber, bouncing off the rough stone walls. Time to plan? And what exactly do you think that's going to get you? He pressed the gun harder against Ben's temple. One wrong move, and your brother dies. You're not going to kill him, Ellie said with quiet certainty. Not yet. No. Kane's eyes narrowed. And why's that? Because you want me to suffer first? Just like you think my father suffered. She took another careful step, drawing Kane's attention. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not the town, not the Red Vultures' reputation. This is about Jim Matthews. A muscle twitched in Kane's jaw. Your father made a fool of me. Drew down on me in front of my own men. Nobody had dared do that before. And you killed him for it. Oh, not right away. Kane's smile was cruel. First, I made him watch as we took everything he'd worked for. His horses, his pride, his life, piece by piece. Just like I'm going to do to you. But while Kane was talking, lost in his own bitter memories, Ben's eyes had never left his sister's face. He saw the subtle shift in her stance, recognized it from their training sessions. His hands, which he'd been carefully working free behind his back, were almost loose. You know what I remember about that day? Ellie's voice was steady, drawing Kane's attention fully to her. I remember watching from the hayloft. I remember how my father faced you, not with fear, but with dignity. Even when he knew he was going to die, he stood true. Kane barked out a harsh laugh. He died in the dirt, begging for his life. You're lying. Ben's voice rang out suddenly, startling everyone. Our pa never begged for anything in his life. Kane's grip on Ben loosened slightly as he turned to strike the boy, and in that instant, everything happened at once. The Derringer seemed to materialize in Ellie's hand. Her first shot caught the nearest bandit in the chest before anyone could react. Her second dropped another as she dove behind a mining cart, drawing their fire. Ben, his hands finally free, drove his elbow back into Kane's stomach and twisted away. Kane's gun went off, the shot going wide as Ben scrambled for cover. The chamber erupted in chaos. Lanterns shattered in the gunfire, plunging sections of the room into darkness. Ellie used the shadows to her advantage, just as her father had taught her. One by one, Kane's men fell to carefully place shots from weapons she retrieved from their fallen comrades. She's just one girl. Kane roared, firing blindly into the darkness. Find her. But his men were panicking now, shooting at shadows. Ellie had become the darkness itself, using every lesson her father had taught her about terrain and patience. The crack of her borrowed rifle echoed through the chamber, each shot finding its mark. When only Kane and his last 2 men remained, she called out, "Last chance, Kane. Surrender, and you might live through this." Never. But there was fear in his voice now. Fear and something else. Something close to understanding. His last men made a break for the tunnel. Ellie let them go. They weren't her target. Instead, she worked her way closer to where Kane had taken cover behind a pile of mining equipment. You want to know something, farm girls? Kane's voice had taken on a manic edge. Your father said something before he died. Want to hear his last words? Nothing you say can hurt me anymore, Kane. Ellie moved silently through the shadows. "You're just a bully who was never as strong as he pretended to be," he said. "My daughter will make you pay." Kane's laugh was tinged with hysteria. "Imagine that. Even dying, he believed in you. Believed his little girl would somehow get revenge." He was right. Ben's voice came from the darkness, making Kane spin around. "But it's not about revenge." Kane fired toward the voice, but Ben had already moved, just as Ellie had taught him. The distraction was all she needed. She burst from cover, closing the distance before Kane could bring his weapon back around. They crashed together in the semi-darkness, fighting for control of the gun. Kane was stronger, but Ellie had positioned herself properly, using leverage just as Carter had taught her. Slowly, inexorably, she forced the weapon away from herself. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," she gritted through clenched teeth. "Oh, I'm going to kill you," Kane snarled. "You and your whole cursed family." But he'd forgotten about Ben again. During the struggle, the boy had circled around behind them. Now he grabbed a fallen lantern and brought it down on Kane's head with all his strength. The gang leader's grip loosened for just a moment. It was enough. Ellie wrenched the gun away and stepped back, keeping the weapon trained on Kane as he staggered to his feet. "It's over," she said firmly. "The Red Vultures are finished." "Nothing's over." Kane drew a hidden knife, lunging at her with desperate speed. Ellie's shot caught him in the chest, the sound thunderous in the confined space. Kane stumbled backward, a look of disbelief crossing his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he slowly collapsed, the knife clattering from his lifeless hand. For a moment, the only sound was the dripping of water somewhere in the darkness. Then Ben crashed into his sister, hugging her fiercely. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice muffled against her shirt. "I knew you'd save me." Ellie held him tight, her eyes burning with tears of relief. "Always, little brother. Always." They made their way out of the mine together, supporting each other. The morning sun seemed impossibly bright after the darkness below, and with it came an unexpected sight. The entire town had gathered just beyond the mine's entrance, led by Sam and Will. "We heard the shots," Sam explained, helping Ellie onto her horse. "Figured you might need a ride home." "The ones that ran," Will reported, "we caught them trying to steal horses from the Peterson farm. They're in custody." Ellie nodded, exhausted but satisfied. "Make sure they face proper justice. No revenge. That's not who we are." As they rode back to Sagebrush, Ben couldn't stop talking about how his sister had fought in the mine. The story would grow with each telling, becoming part of the town's legend. But for Ellie, the most important part was riding beside her, safe and sound. She touched the spot where a bullet had grazed her arm during the fight. The wound would heal, leaving another scar to remind her of this day. But unlike the emotional scars left by her father's death, this one would mark a victory, a moment when justice had finally been served. The Red Vultures were finished. Kane's remaining men would flee, spreading word of what happened to those who threatened Sagebrush. Other towns would hear the story of the farm girl who brought down the territory's most feared gang. But that wasn't what mattered to Ellie. What mattered was riding home with her brother, knowing their father would be proud. What mattered was seeing her mother's face light up with joy as they approached the farm. What mattered was the knowledge that the people of Sagebrush could sleep safely tonight, free from fear at last. The sun was setting as they crested the final hill overlooking the town. Its light painted the buildings in shades of gold, making everything seem warm and peaceful. Looking at it now, you'd never know the struggles they'd faced, the battles they'd won. "You okay?" Ben asked, pulling up beside her. Ellie smiled, remembering her father's words about standing up to bullies, about doing what's right even when you're scared. "Yeah, little brother. I'm just fine." Together, they rode down toward home, leaving the shadow of the Red Vultures behind them forever. A week after Kane's defeat, Sagebrush was still buzzing with activity. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as townsfolk worked together to repair the damage from the battles. But there was something different in the way people moved now, a confidence, a pride that hadn't been there before. The town hall was packed for what everyone knew would be an important announcement. Sheriff Monroe stood at the front of the room, his badge gleaming in the morning light streaming through the windows. For once, he stood straight-backed, no longer bearing the weight of fear that had haunted him for so long. "Folks," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the crowd, "I've served as your sheriff for 5 years now. Took the job because nobody else wanted it. But recent events have shown me something important. This town deserves better than a man who wears the badge out of obligation." He unpinned the star from his vest, holding it up so it caught the light. "This badge should be worn by someone who truly protects and serves. Someone who's proven they have the courage and wisdom to lead." His eyes found Ellie in the crowd. "Miss Matthews, would you step forward?" A murmur of approval ran through the gathering as Ellie made her way to the front. She moved carefully, her side still tender where Kane's bullet had grazed her, but her steps were sure. "The town council has already approved this," Monroe continued. "If you're willing, we'd be honored to have you as our new sheriff." Ellie looked out at the faces watching her, friends, neighbors, people who had stood together against the Red Vultures. Her eyes found Ben in the crowd, practically bouncing with excitement, and her mother, whose proud smile reminded her so much of her father. "I'll accept," she said finally, "on one condition. Deputy Sam keeps his badge. He's earned it." Sam's face reddened with pleasure as the crowd erupted in cheers. Monroe pinned the badge to Ellie's vest, then stepped back with visible relief. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing me what real courage looks like." The weeks that followed were busy ones for Sagebrush. Under Ellie's guidance, the town didn't just rebuild, it improved. The general store, where Mr. Carter had made his last stand, was renovated with better defenses. The church steeple, which had served as her sniper's nest, was reinforced and equipped with a proper watchpost. But more importantly, the people themselves were changing. Neighbors who had once hurried past each other now stopped to chat. Doors that had been kept fearfully locked were opened in welcome. The spirit of unity that had helped them defeat the Red Vultures grew stronger with each passing day. Ben's recovery was particularly remarkable. Though the physical bruises from his ordeal faded quickly, Ellie had worried about deeper scars. But her brother's spirit proved as resilient as ever. "I've been thinking," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch of their farmhouse. "Maybe I could help you train the younger kids in town. You know, teach them what you taught me about standing up for themselves." Ellie smiled, remembering how far he'd come from the boy practicing with his slingshot. "That's a fine idea, Ben. But remember what Pa always said. Teaching others is the best way to master something yourself." Ben finished with a grin. "I remember." Speaking of Pa, they rode together to the family plot the next morning. The summer wildflowers were in full bloom, painting the hillside in vibrant colors. Ellie knelt beside her father's grave, gently clearing away some fallen leaves from the headstone. "You were right, Pa," she said softly. "About everything. About standing up to bullies, about protecting what matters, about the importance of patience and practice." She touched the badge on her vest. "I hope I'm making you proud." "He is proud," Ben said with absolute certainty. "Just like Mr. Carter would be." The mention of Carter brought a bittersweet smile to Ellie's face. The town had come together to create a proper memorial for the old gunsmith, transforming his shop into something special. The front still served as a gunsmith shop, now run by his nephew who had arrived from back east. But the back room had become a classroom of sorts, where Ellie and Sam taught townsfolk the skills they'd need to defend themselves. "Remember," she told her students during one session, "it's not about being the fastest or the strongest. It's about being smart, being prepared, and working together." The training sessions became a regular part of town life. Even those who had never held a gun before learned basic self-defense. Women who had once hidden from conflict now stood tall, confident in their ability to protect their families. One evening, as Ellie was cleaning her father's rifle at the kitchen table, her mother sat down across from her. Sarah Matthews watched her daughter's sure movements with the weapon, seeing so much of Jim in the way Ellie handled it. "I used to be so afraid," Sarah admitted quietly. "After we lost your father, I thought the only way to keep you and Ben safe was to keep you from fighting. I was wrong." Ellie set down the rifle, reaching across to take her mother's hand. "You were trying to protect us, Mama, just like Pa was trying to protect us his way. And now you're protecting everyone." Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. "Jim would be so proud of the woman you've become. So am I." Their relationship had grown stronger through everything that had happened. The shared grief of losing Jim, the fear during Ben's kidnapping, the pride in their family's part in saving the town. It had all brought them closer together. Word of what happened in Sagebrush spread quickly through the territory. Travelers brought news of other towns inspired by their example, standing up to various gangs that had terrorized them. Some came seeking advice on how to organize their own defenses. One such visitor arrived on a dusty afternoon about a month after Kane's defeat. The stranger's horse was trail-worn, and his clothes spoke of long days in the saddle. But there was something in the way he carried himself that caught Ellie's attention, an alertness that reminded her of her father. Sheriff Matthews. He touched his hat politely. Name's Marshal Daniel Blake. Mind if we talk privately? In her office, the marshal got straight to the point. What you did here, standing up to the Red Vultures, organizing the town's defense, it's impressive. But it's also stirred up a hornet's nest. Ellie leaned back in her chair, studying the marshal's weathered face. How so? Kane wasn't just some random outlaw. He had connections, powerful ones. People who provided him with information, bought his stolen goods, kept the law off his back. Blake's eyes were grave. Those people aren't happy about losing their investment. Are you warning me or threatening me, Marshal? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Warning. What you started here, it's giving people hope, making them think they don't have to bow down to criminals anymore. That makes certain folks nervous. Good, Ellie said firmly. They should be nervous. Blake nodded slowly. Just watch your back, Sheriff. And if you ever need help. He placed a badge on her desk, not a local sheriff star, but the symbol of a federal marshal. You got friends too? After the marshal left, Ellie stood at her office window, watching the afternoon traffic on Sagebrush's main street. Children played freely, no longer hustled inside at the first sign of strangers. Shopkeepers chatted with customers on their porches. The town had come alive again. Let them come, she thought. Whether it was Kane's powerful friends or some other threat, Sagebrush was ready. They weren't victims anymore. They were defenders, protectors, a community united in purpose. She touched her father's rifle, now mounted proudly on the wall behind her desk. Its inscription caught the late afternoon light. Stand true. That evening, as she made her rounds of the town, people called out greetings. Mrs. Tanner pressed a fresh loaf of bread into her hands. Will, who had become one of her most dedicated deputies, gave her an update on the new warning system they developed. From the church steeple, now a proper watchtower, she could see the whole valley. The setting sun painted the landscape in gorgeous shades of orange and purple. Somewhere out there, new threats might be gathering, but they would find more than just a farm girl waiting for them. They would find a town that had learned to stand together. They would find people who had discovered their own strength. They would find Ellie Matthews, daughter of Jim Matthews, sheriff of Sagebrush, ready to face whatever challenges came next. The badge on her vest caught the last rays of sunlight, not as a burden like it had been for Monroe, but as a symbol of everything they had fought for: justice, protection, community. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but she carried it willingly, proudly. A cool evening breeze carried the scent of sage and desert flowers. Below, the town's lights began to twinkle on one by one, each one representing a family, a story, a piece of what made Sagebrush worth protecting. Ben's voice called up from below. Ellie, Mama says supper's ready. She smiled, taking one last look at the darkening horizon. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The farm girl who had once been dismissed and underestimated had found her true calling, not just as a protector, but as a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever felt powerless against evil. The Red Vultures had laughed at her once. Now their laughter was silenced, replaced by the sound of a community rebuilding, growing stronger, standing tall. As she climbed down from the watchtower, Ellie remembered something her father used to say. The true measure of strength isn't in how hard you can hit, but in what you choose to protect. Sagebrush had found its strength, and Ellie Matthews had found her purpose. The sun set on another day in the transformed town, but unlike the fearful nights of the past, this darkness held no terror. They were ready for whatever dawn might bring. After all, they had learned the most important lesson of all, that ordinary people, standing together, could accomplish extraordinary things. And it had all started with a farm girl who refused to back down. 5 years had passed since the defeat of the Red Vultures, and Sagebrush had transformed beyond recognition. The once struggling frontier settlement had become a thriving town, its streets bustling with commerce and life. New buildings of brick and stone had replaced many of the old wooden structures, and gardens bloomed where dust had once blown. From her position on the newly built sheriff's office porch, Ellie Matthews watched the morning activity with quiet satisfaction. At 24, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. The badge on her vest had become as natural as breathing, though she never took its responsibility lightly. "Morning, Sheriff," called out familiar voices as townspeople passed by. Children waved excitedly, many of them too young to remember the days when fear had ruled these streets. A tall young man emerged from the gunsmith shop across the street, now expanded into a proper firearms and security consultation business. At 17, Ben Matthews had grown into his father's height and his sister's determined spirit. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew his place in the world. "Another busy day at the shop," he reported, joining Ellie on the porch. "3 more towns sent representatives to learn about our defense programs. Word keeps spreading." Ellie smiled proudly at her brother. After the defeat of the Red Vultures, Ben had thrown himself into learning everything he could about community defense. Now he helped run what they called the Sagebrush Security School, teaching other towns how to protect themselves. Speaking of spreading the word, he continued, "The preparations for the anniversary celebration are almost ready. The whole territory's talking about it." The annual celebration of the Red Vultures' defeat had become something far bigger than Sagebrush alone. People came from all over to commemorate not just a victory over bandits, but the moment when ordinary people discovered their power to stand against tyranny. "Mrs. Tanner's already baking enough pies to feed an army," Ben grinned. "And Will's got the younger kids practicing the reenactment again." The thought of the children's enthusiastic portrayal of the battle brought a smile to Ellie's face. They had turned the story into something of a morality play, with the youngest ones taking turns playing the farm girl who stood up to the bandits. Later that afternoon, Ellie visited the town schoolhouse, where she regularly taught classes on more than just shooting. Today's lesson was about courage and community. "Remember," she told the eager young faces, "strength isn't just about being able to fight. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for, and being smart about how you protect it." A small girl in the front row raised her hand. "Is it true you weren't scared at all when you faced the Red Vultures?" "Of course I was scared," Ellie answered honestly. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do what's right even when you are afraid." Among her students was young Tommy Reynolds, whose father had once ridden with the Red Vultures. After Kane's defeat, Jack Reynolds had surrendered himself to Ellie, seeking a chance to make amends. It hadn't been easy. Many in town had opposed giving him a second chance. But Ellie had remembered something her father once said: "The true test of justice is how we treat those who want to change." 5 years later, Jack Reynolds had proven that trust well placed. He worked as the town's stable master, his knowledge of horses and honest labor gradually earning him acceptance in the community. His son Tommy sat proudly in class, no longer bearing the shame of his father's past. That evening, as Ellie walked through the town's newly paved streets, she marveled at how much had changed. The general store where Mr. Carter had made his last stand was now the largest trading post in the territory. The church steeple, once her sniper's nest, housed a proper bell that rang out the hours in peaceful celebration. She paused at the town square, where a simple monument stood bearing the names of those who had fought to protect Sagebrush. Mr. Carter's name held a place of honor, along with others who had sacrificed everything for their community. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" a voice asked behind her. Ellie turned to find a well-dressed man she didn't recognize, carrying a leather satchel and a notebook. "Name's Edward Pierce," he introduced himself. "I'm a historian from back east, documenting the transformation of the frontier territories. Your town's story has become something of a legend." "The legend probably sounds more exciting than the reality," Ellie said modestly. "On the contrary," Pierce replied, opening his notebook. "From what I've gathered, the reality is far more remarkable. A young woman standing up to one of the most notorious gangs in the territory? A town finding its courage and unity? These are the stories that shape history." Over the next few days, Pierce interviewed many townspeople, documenting their memories of the battle and its aftermath. But more importantly, he recorded how Sagebrush had changed, how it had become a model for other communities seeking to protect themselves. Your methods have spread far beyond this one town, he told Ellie as they walked through the bustling streets. Communities all over the territory are adopting your training programs, your defense strategies. You've created something lasting here. Ellie knew he was right. The legacy of Sagebrush wasn't just in its buildings or its prosperity. It was in the way it had shown others that they didn't have to live in fear. On the morning of the anniversary celebration, before the crowds arrived, Ellie rode out to her father's grave. The family plot was well maintained now, with flowers blooming even in the late summer heat. She carried her father's rifle, the weapon that had helped save the town. Its inscription, "Stand True," had become Sagebrush's unofficial motto. "It's time, Pa," she said softly, kneeling beside the grave. "Time to let this chapter end." Carefully, she placed the rifle across the grave, securing it with brackets she'd had specially made. The morning sun caught the well-worn metal, making it gleam. "We don't need it anymore," she continued. "The town knows how to protect itself now, and there are better ways to honor your memory than holding onto the tools of violence." The gesture was symbolic. Of course, she still carried a gun as sheriff. But this particular weapon, which had seen so much history, deserved its rest. When she returned to town, the celebration was in full swing. Bunting decorated the buildings, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. Children ran through the streets, playing at being heroes and bandits, though the real meaning of those days had faded into legend for them. Ben found her watching the festivities from her usual spot on the sheriff's office porch. "Just got word from Marshal Blake," he reported. 3 more gang leaders surrendered yesterday. Said they'd rather face justice than wait for their towns to pull a sagebrush on them. Ellie laughed softly. "Is that what they're calling it now?" "That's not all they're calling it. Some folks are calling it the Sagebrush Revolution. Ordinary people standing up to protect themselves instead of waiting for someone else to save them." The celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing in the town square. Ellie watched as Jack Reynolds taught young children to dance, their parents smiling in acceptance. Nearby, Will, now her senior deputy, supervised the younger deputies he was training. The historian Pierce was moving through the crowd, still taking notes. "This is remarkable," he told Ellie when he spotted her. "Most towns celebrate their founding or religious holidays. But Sagebrush celebrates the moment it found its courage." "We celebrate community," Ellie corrected him. "We celebrate the fact that ordinary people, working together, can accomplish extraordinary things." As night fell, lanterns were lit throughout the town, their warm glow reflecting off the new buildings. From her vantage point, Ellie could see how much Sagebrush had grown. New homes and businesses stretched toward the horizon, and more were being built every month. But more importantly, she could see how the people had grown. Children played freely in the streets, unafraid of strangers. Neighbors looked out for each other. The fear that had once ruled their lives had been replaced by something stronger, trust in themselves and each other. The next morning, after the celebrations had ended and the town was returning to its normal rhythm, Ellie made a decision. She'd been thinking about it for a while, and the time felt right. She called Ben and Sam into her office. "I'm taking a leave of absence," she announced. "There are other towns out there that need help learning what we learned here. Marshal Blake's been asking me to help organize a broader training program." "How long will you be gone?" Ben asked, though his smile suggested he'd been expecting this. "As long as it takes. Sam will be acting sheriff while I'm away." She turned to her longtime deputy. "Think you can handle it?" Sam touched the badge he'd worn proudly for 5 years. "You taught us well, Ellie. We'll keep Sagebrush safe." The news spread quickly through the town, but there was no fear this time. Sagebrush had learned to stand on its own, and its people knew their strength wasn't in any one person, but in their unity and determination. Early the next morning, before most of the town was awake, Ellie mounted her horse. She carried only what she needed: her sheriff's badge, her gun, and the lessons she'd learned about courage and community. Ben and her mother came to see her off. "You'll come back?" Sarah Matthews asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Of course." Ellie hugged them both. "Sagebrush will always be home. But there are other towns out there that need to learn what we learned, that they don't have to live in fear." As she rode out of town, Ellie looked back one last time. The rising sun painted Sagebrush in shades of gold and promise. New buildings gleamed, The church bell rang out clear and strong, and the streets were already coming alive with peaceful activity. 5 years ago, a farm girl had stood against tyranny and discovered her true strength. Now that strength had grown into something far bigger than one person or one town. It had become a legacy of hope, a testament to the power of ordinary people standing together. The Red Vultures had laughed at a farm girl once, but their laughter had faded into history, while her example lived on, inspiring others to find their own courage, their own strength, their own way to stand true. Ellie Matthews rode toward the horizon, but she wasn't riding away from her story. She was riding toward its next chapter, carrying with her the lessons of Sagebrush, that true strength lies not in weapons or fear, but in the courage to protect what matters, and the wisdom to teach others to do the same. Behind her, Sagebrush stood proud and strong, a beacon of hope in the territory. Before her stretched endless possibilities, other communities waiting to learn what one small town had discovered. The legend of the farm girl who stood up to the Red Vultures would live on, not just in history books or celebration days, but in the lasting change she had helped create, a world where ordinary people knew their own strength and used it to protect what mattered most. And so Ellie rode on, toward new horizons and new challenges, carrying with her the greatest lesson of all, that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage, and that true legacy lies not in what we claim for ourselves, but in what we help others discover within themselves. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of unexpected heroes and the moments that define the American frontier. From fearless marshals to cunning outlaws, from tragic love stories to triumphant victories, there's always another legend waiting to be told around our campfire. Until next time, remember, sometimes the quietest voice carries the strongest spirit.